First crop we're going to look at is barley. Barley is quite an important crop in Ireland. Here's a lovely field full of barley, and you can easily identify it by the presence of these little awns that are sticking out past the spike on the barley. Generally speaking, the main crops that we would be talking about in terms of cereals in Ireland would be barley, wheat and oats, although barley far outstrips the other two in terms of the level of production in Ireland, with about 200,000 hectares of barley grown each year. That will be divided up about 90%, 10% between winter barley and spring barley, and that's for all the reasons that we studied in the crop cultivation chapter. Winter barley being generally hardier, having a longer growing season, which leads to a higher yield, and also the fact that you can sow your winter barley in the autumn at a time when things are a little bit quieter, rather than in the spring, where on a mixed farm you might have a lot of other things going on, such as calving or lambing, etc. All of these cereals are members of the Poaceae family, which is the grass family. It was a lot easier when that used to be called Gramineae. But what makes them different is the arrangement of the grain up here on the stem. So if we look first of all at the wheat, we'll see that the little spikelets, as they're called, those are the tiny little grains, are arranged on the central stem or rachis in an arrangement that is just as if they were stuck straight onto the rachis. That is the same for your barley. However, the difference with the barley, as we mentioned in the first slide, is that it has these little projections that look like little threads, and they're called awns. Oats, on the other hand, have quite a different arrangement of their spikelets. Their spikelets seem to be hanging out of that central rachis or central stem on little side branches, as you can see here. And that is called a panicle arrangement, but you don't need to know about that for now. However, you sometimes will see wild oats in your barley. They're a weed of barley, and this is what they would look like growing in your field of barley. So the structure then of the barley plant, starting at the bottom, you have your roots, you have a stem going up the middle, and then you have the leaves growing in little pairs up along the stem. Then you have your seed head, and that's the bit we're mainly interested in. It has little spikelets arranged along your central rachis, and then it has the awns that I mentioned earlier. When we're talking about the uses of barley, we're mainly interested in the grain up here in the seed head. However, we can use the stem as well for barley straw. Which brings us nicely to the uses of barley. So in Ireland, we have feeding barley, and that is used as animal fodder, so winter feeding or as part of concentrates. And then malting barley, as the name suggests, is used in the production of alcohol, and that barley has to be of a very high quality. And finally, we use the barley straw primarily as animal bedding, although you might also use a little in feeding. Now, a new section of the course, the growth stages of barley. So like any plant, when you plant the seed, first of all, the seed's going to have to germinate. Then the next stage is leaf emergence. So the crop starts to produce leaves, and it does this at what's called a continuous thermal rate, which brings in a new term, the phyllochron. And the phyllochron is the number of days between the emergence of a leaf and the next leaf. Now, the later you sow your barley, the shorter that phyllochron is, and that has an impact on leaf number. So if you sow your barley in spring, you'll find that you have a shorter phyllochron, and also you will have less leaves than if you sow it in the autumn. So if you're sowing your winter barley, you tend to get more leaves and a longer phyllochron. The average number of leaves per plant is about 8 leaves. Now, a fairly important concept in our cereal production is tillering. And here you will see a picture of some tillering going on. And tillering refers to the ability that cereals have and grasses have to form side shoots from the main shoot. So generally speaking, down at the bottom of the main shoot, you'll get a kind of a side root, and it will grow out from the plant make contact with the ground, and then where it makes contact, it will send down its own little root system, and you'll get another plant growing off the main plant while still attached to that main plant. Tillering accounts for a massive increase in the productivity of our cereals, and some varieties of cereals are prized for their tillering abilities or their tendency to tiller. But you can also increase the rate of tillering by such things as adding extra phosphorus, for example. Or, again, to go back to growing our winter barley, the natural tillering rate is increased by shocks to the plant, such as a hard frost or a series of frosts. Now, the next stage then is canopy formation. That's low enough at first, as you only have a few leaves, but then it expands as the leaves emerge and start to do more photosynthesis at that stage. Now, the leaf production will cease once you get ears emerging and the stem is fully grown, which brings us on to stem extension then. You will have in barley 4 leaves at ground level and 4 on the stem. So once you've got the stem growing up from ground level, then it's more susceptible to frost at the growth point. Now, throughout this whole process, you have biomass accumulation going on. So as your canopy increases, so as you've got more leaves on the plant and those leaves are getting a bit bigger, the plant can do more photosynthesis. The more photosynthesis it can do, the more starch it can generate, the more biomass it can generate. At the start, that biomass is sent into the leaves, making the leaves grow bigger. Then it's sent into the stem, making the plant grow taller. And then we get on to sending it into the ear for ear formation. And once that happens, the stem reaches its final height and actually stops growing, and then that biomass is sent towards the grain finally and in the latter stages of growth. Now, to look at ear formation then, to sum up the whole process, the more tillering you can get in your barley, the more side shoots you get. The more shoots you get, the more ears you get. The more ears you have, the higher your grain yield. Now, it takes 35 days for your ear to fully form on your barley plant. And once it has fully formed, then the grains inside start to fill. Now, that takes up to 40 days for the complete filling of the grain inside. And the starch at this stage is being diverted from the stem of the plant into the grain, and that's how you get your good grain yield. Now, next we need to look at why people would select certain varieties of barley seed. So a farmer has a choice as to what barley seed he's going to sow, and a number of factors come into making this choice. Generally, barley varieties are chosen for their yield, and linked to that, of course, is their tillering ability, because as we explained, the more tillering, the more shoots you get. The more shoots you get, the more ears you have, and in turn, the more grains you have and the higher yield. The strength of their straw and the shortness of their straw, and the two of those are related to a problem that we sometimes get in our cereal crops called lodging, which we'll be looking at in a later slide. And the earliness of their ripening, their disease resistance, and their resistance to lodging, which, as I said, is related to the strength and shortness of the straw. And finally, if we're talking about a winter variety of cereal, which we tend to be in Ireland, and certainly in relation to barley we are, their winter hardiness. Teagasc could do studies on tillering. It's so important that they will produce reports comparing the different varieties, such as Rosamond here and Aberdeen, comparing their respective tillering ability. You see there's a lot more tillering going on here, lots of little lateral roots coming out from the base of this particular plant. Now, lodging. So lodging is the tendency of cereal crops to bend over so that they lie more or less flat on the ground. It's a big problem in Ireland if you get some particularly bad weather. Once your crop is at a long stem stage, and it makes it virtually impossible to harvest the crop, so it reduces your yield quite considerably. Now we can avoid lodging by getting our timing right. So in the winter cereal, if you sow it on the correct date, it'll be at exactly the right stage of growth when you press pause essentially during the winter. And that will mean that it hasn't got so long that it's likely to be knocked over by strong winds and bad weather. So what are the popular barley varieties then? Well, here are two of them. We have Saffron and Amarina. Saffron's a two-row British variety. What do I mean by a two-row? It means that there's two little spikes attached along your central stem. It's moderately late maturing. It has high yield potential. It has a moderately short straw. However, it is susceptible to mildew and moderately susceptible to our Rhynchosporium. It's quite resistant to rust, which is another problem in your variety, and it has good resistance to net blotch as well. Amarina then is a 6-row French variety. It is moderately early maturing, has a high yield potential just like the saffron, has good resistance to mildew, brown rust and net blotch, moderately resistant to Rhynchosporium, a small grain with a low weight, and generally, of course, the grain quality of your 6 rows varieties tends to be inferior to the 2-row varieties anyway. So that gives you an idea of the characteristics of the different varieties that are considered when a farmer is picking. And here are some other varieties there shown in the picture in the background. Now, cultivating your barley then. What do I mean by cultivating? I mean the process of preparing the ground to grow your barley. So first of all, the soil and the climate. In terms of suitable soils for your barley, generally you'd like good drainage, definitely, and a pH of 6.5. Now, the feeding barley will grow on a wide range of soils in comparison to the malting barley, and as long as there's a pH of 6 or more, you'll get away with it for your feeding barley, but you'd like a higher pH, 6.5, for your malting barley. The soil types that are suitable would be your brown earths and your grey brown podzolics. So it tends to be grown in Wexford and Louth, where you have the weather conditions and also the soils. And it can be grown as well in the Midlands, where you have your grey-brown podzolics. In terms of temperature then, barley likes generally warm temperatures. Bright sunny conditions lead to higher growth. So I'm talking about in the middle of the growth phase here, which will lead to a higher yield. But they do still require a steady supply of moisture, and that's why Ireland is relatively suitable for growing barley. Of course, when it comes to harvesting, then you want dry weather for the harvesting to dry out the grain. And then we come to our seeding rate. So your seed rate in kilograms per hectare is calculated by looking at your target population and multiplying that by your 1,000 grain weight and dividing it by the expected establishment rate. And there's an example of that given in your book if you'd like to have a look at it. Now, what factors then influence the seeding rate? The seedbed and the soil conditions, the seed quality, the time of planting, because that will have an impact on the establishment rate. If you can get your winter variety in bang on the 1st of October, then you'll have a very good establishment rate. Whereas the later you sow your varieties in general, the lower the establishment rate that you get, and therefore the more you have to sow, the more seed you have to sow to take that lower establishment rate into account. And using certified seed, because if you use certified seed, then you're guaranteed a high germination rate and therefore establishment rate. So how do we prepare the seed bed? Well, for winter barley, you would plough it in the autumn and then you'd harrow, or alternatively, you could go for a min-till or a minimum tillage operation. The idea behind that is that you try to do the least cultivation possible, the least churning up of the ground possible, i.e. no ploughing. And you can sow it by direct drilling. Now, the advantages of using this min-till or this direct drilling approach would be that it reduces the labour, so you're not having to go in there numerous times, once with your plough and then with your harrow, etc. It also reduces the fuel and the energy costs and the time, I guess. It helps the crop to retain moisture better and also to retain cover. Now, if you are looking at spring barley, then you're not going to plough in the autumn if you're going planting spring barley, because you have to plough within 6 weeks of sowing. So you're just going to plough right before you sow in spring. You're waiting, of course, for the weather to be suitable to do that. Now, that has the disadvantage that the ground hasn't been exposed to the weathering process over the winter. You then prepare a fine seed bed and you sow it to a fairly shallow depth. So recommended would be somewhere in the region of 1.75 centimetres to 2.5 centimetres, certainly not any deeper than 5 centimetres. And then you roll. You'll notice that rolling is not mentioned in the winter barley. Rolling is necessary in the spring barley because you'd be hoping at least that the soil is that bit drier. So you want to ensure that there's a good contact between the seed and the seed bed in order to increase the likelihood of it germinating. During winter cultivations, you're not going to be rolling after you sow the seed, number one, because it should be wet enough in there anyway for there to be good contact between the seed and the soil, but also because if you get rain after it, you run the risk of capping, which will lower your germination and establishment. Now, in spring barley as well, you could also use a one-pass method or a combine drill. Now, there are some doubts as to the effectiveness of your combine drill in terms of the percentage establishment. There's been a lot of studies on that, and some studies have shown a lower establishment rate when you use a combine drill than when you do the other separate cultivations, and certainly you can have more weed problems when you're not ploughing and harrowing. But as I mentioned earlier, you're reducing your labour, reducing your fuel, and you are aiding the structure of your soil as well by not subjecting it to major cultivation. So in summary there, your seedbed and sowing dates: for winter barley, you sow with a combine drill. For spring barley, you plough and harrow and roll. And then for winter barley, you sow in late September, ideally on the 1st of October, because that allows your barley to get to the grass stage before the winter weather sets in. It's not getting too long, because if it gets too long and stemmy, you might have a susceptibility to lodging over the winter. But you do want to get it to the grass stage so that it is less susceptible to the frosts. And then your spring barley, you would sow somewhere between February and April. Ideally, you'd like to be getting in there in February, but of course that is weather dependent. Now, some of the machinery that you could use then: here's your power harrow, and it's breaking up the surface of the soil, and it is breaking the clods that are left after ploughing, and it's levelling off the surface to prepare the seed bed. Those clods, of course, could stop the young and delicate leaves from emerging, so it's good to get them broken up. Here's a roller. Again, it breaks some of the clods that are left on the surface, and it firms the seed bed and increases the contact between the seed and the soil, which is important in particular in your spring sowing. And here's a combine drill. So your combine drill there is putting down the seed and it's putting fertilizer down with it. Now, some farmers elect to leave what are called tram lines when they are sowing, and those tram lines are just parallel lines through the crop that allow the farmer to get in there with his tractor afterwards if he wants to spray with fungicides, pesticides, etc. And he's not damaging crop that he has sown. Next, we look at the application of fertilizers. So when you're sowing your seed, you can use CAN, you can use 18-6-12 or 10-10-20. Any of those fertilizers. CAN, of course, is a straight nitrogen fertilizer, whereas the other two are combination fertilizers with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in those ratios, either 18-6-12 or 10-10-20. In spring barley, you can use a split dressing, and a split dressing means that you'll put some of that nitrogen on at the start when you're sowing, probably about 30% or so, and the rest then you will put on during the mid-tillering stage. So once it has started tillering, now that's called a split dressing. And then if you are growing winter barley, you have to be careful not to add too much nitrogen, because this can increase the weight of the seed head too early, and if it does, you will get lodging. In malting barley, you're not going to put on any nitrogen because there tends to be enough nitrogen for it. If you have too high nitrogen in your malting barley, it makes it unsuitable for brewing, and that means that you don't use a split dressing in that case. There is also some use for organic manures like your farmyard manure and your slurry, and they will provide a certain amount of your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which will allow you to reduce the amount of artificial fertilizer you use. Now, diseases, pests, weeds, etc. Barley can be susceptible to a number of different diseases, pests, and weeds. Under the heading of fungal diseases, first of all, we have our rhynchosporium or rhynchosporium, depending where you're from. We also have powdery mildew, we've leaf rust, and we've a few others. Now, the important thing is if you're asked anything about fungal diseases, your main method of treatment is by spraying fungicide, and that'll work on any of them. So, first of all, your rhynchosporium, also called leaf blotch or scald. The symptoms, you can see them here in the picture. It's a kind of a diamond shape patch of chlorosis meaning the lightening of the leaf colour there on the leaves. It then leads to a decrease in the grain quality and in the yield. It's spread by rain splash, so it's particularly prevalent during wet weather. We've all said from the start that your barley prefers nice dry conditions when it is growing, albeit with enough moisture. And then treatment would be to spray it with fungicide twice during the growth cycle. It could be prevented by sowing a resistant variety. If you remember, we mentioned that in the characteristics of the different varieties that you would look out for disease resistance, and certain varieties of seed have more resistance to fungal diseases such as rhynchosporium than others. Now, the second fungal disease that we'll look at is powdery mildew, and you'll see here there's a kind of a greyish white spot on the leaf. It starts out in the leaves and initially, and then it spreads all over the plant after that. Again, wet weather will increase the chances of getting this fungus. All funguses really like warm, wet conditions. So the drier the weather, the less likely you are to get this powdery mildew. Now it can also though overwinter on winter sown crops, so it can stay in the crop over winter. The best thing you can do again is to spray fungicide or proper stubble treatment like harrowing in your stubble, and early ploughing will also help prevent your powdery mildew. Then we look at leaf stripe. Now what's happening with your leaf stripe, you can see that you have these kind of brown stripes on the young leaves, and it starts out with the fungus actually attacking the grain, and then after germination, when you start to get the leaves, you'll see that the fungus has attacked those leaves and left the brown stripes on them. And again, the main way of dealing with that would be using fungicides, and a lot of times your certified seed will have been treated or dressed, it is called, which means it's had that fungicide put on it already. And then the last one of our fungal diseases that I'd like to look at is loose smut. In this one you can see a kind of a brownish looking dust appears on the ears of the barley. There's spores from the fungus inside in that dust, and then it grows into the grain and it can seriously affect it. It kills off bits of the crop. Again, it's prevented by spraying with fungicide and also by seed dressing, which is when fungicide is put on the seed. Next we look at some pests. So we're finished with the fungal diseases. Now we're moving on to look at the pests. The big ones that we have to think about are aphids, wireworms and leather jackets. Now all of them can be controlled by spraying with suitable pesticides. Now here we have a picture of our main problem with our aphid or our greenfly. The greenfly spreads a virus called yellow dwarf virus, and you can see the yellowing of the leaves that accompanies that yellow dwarf virus. But as I said, spraying with pesticide will get rid of that. Then wireworms. Wireworms here are the larvae of our click beetle, excuse me. Generally, you won't have a problem with these unless you're sowing your barley after a lay. Now, what happens is the female lays little eggs in near the roots, and then those little worms, when they hatch out, they feed on the roots. They'll also go up and feed on the stem, and they will reduce the yield, and by weakening the stem, they'll cause lodging as well. Again, these can be controlled by your seed dressing. So if your seed dressing has fungicide and pesticide on it, it is likely to prevent wireworms. Leather jackets then are the larvae of your crane fly or daddy longlegs. The adult crane fly lays eggs on the grass part, and then the larvae of the crane fly feed on the grass. Again, you must spray for this. So you spray your insecticide to get rid of your leather jacket. Now we've looked at fungal diseases and we've looked at pests. The next thing to consider is weeds. And your main weeds that you'd be looking at in barley would be your wild oats and your charlock. And they can be controlled using selective herbicides. Once you see signs of them, you would generally spray with herbicide after leaves have emerged at the 3 to 5 leaf stage. Another suitable method of preventing weeds would be by implementing good crop rotation practices and by stubble cleaning. And stubble cleaning is where you plough the leftovers or stubble after you've harvested a crop. You plough that back in to the soil. So let's have a quick look at rotation then. Now, if you're talking about feeding barley, you generally aren't that worried about pests that might stay in the soil or build up in the soil, and diseases that might build up in the soil. So rotation isn't so much of a concern. You could actually grow your feeding barley pretty much continuously. However, Rotation in this case will still increase the yield, so it is worth doing for that reason. And it's important not to grow barley after growing grass because you are susceptible to similar problems with the barley that you'd have had with the grass, and therefore you should try to spread them out in your rotation if possible. Then if you're talking about malting barley, so that's the barley for the brewing industry, you wouldn't grow that after the grass or legumes either, and the legumes will produce too much nitrogen for your malting barley. You want to keep that nitrogen a little bit lower in the malting barley. Here's a picture of a rotation. And here's another. And now that brings us on to harvesting. So how do you know when your barley's ripe? Well, the grains go dry and hard and their colour fades, and the ear kind of falls to the side and lies parallel to the stem. So it looks like it's drooping down basically parallel to the stem, and that's because the weight of the ear is quite heavy at that point. Usually you'll be harvesting your winter barley in July, and your spring barley could be harvested in August. Harvesting uses a combine harvester. Here's a picture of your combine harvester, and it reaps and thrashes and winnows. So basically reaping means it's cutting the stalk off the grain, and then thrashing and winnowing help to release that grain from the husk. Now, the average yield from winter barley is around 8 or 9 tonnes per hectare, which, as we've mentioned on a few occasions, is higher than your spring barley, which is 6 to 8 tonnes per hectare. Once you've harvested it, then you treat it with acid, and that should help to prevent attacks from pests and also some diseases when you're storing it. You have to make sure that you store it in a well-ventilated shed as well, as that will also help it to stay healthy. It'll prevent fungal diseases, and you will store it in the dark, and storing it in the dark prevents it from sprouting, which of course you don't want your grain sprouting. And what I mean by sprouting is developing little shoots and roots out of the grain. And that is the end of our barley.